listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. We have another great show for you today. Let's get ready to go against the grain. We'll be kicking off the show with Democrats losing an infinitely winnable special election in California to fill Katie Hill's seat. This was an embarrassing loss considering Clinton won that district by 6 and Hill won that seat handsomely by 9. Immediately after, we'll get into the lack of COVID testing in prisons and homeless shelters, basically locations of densely populated human beings that create a high propensity for viral spread. These are the invisible people within our society, but they are people nonetheless. We'll also get into Pompeo's visit to Israel for the immoral task of discussions of annexation. Basically a $20 word for stealing someone else's land with the backing of superpower in order to protect you while you do it. Last but not also, the Democratic Party has come to the rescue with an 18,000-page, $3 trillion plan to rescue America. Too bad they've already given Republicans everything that they wanted in the last 4 packages, where Democrats weren't interested in rescuing America and ensuring the quote-unquote heroes, as they're calling them, were taken care of. 33 million people without a job, 30 million people without health care, and even before all of this took place, the majority of people were living paycheck to paycheck, and the majority of the people did not have $500 in the bank. This is where we are. But now, after 4 plans, we're going to deal with the heroes. That's right, Nancy Pelosi, pushing a unicorn that has 0 chance of passing. We'll be discussing that later in the first hour. In the second hour, we'll get into Flynn being released and the complete implosion of Russiagate with the recent disclosures of the FBI agents on the case, and the recent disclosures from CrowdStrike's president Sean Henry revealing that no evidence that any of the emails were actually taken from the Democratic servers. We'll also delve into the potential worker protections available in the time of this pandemic, considering that federal and various state governments have made the choice to force workers back into harm's way. Today is Wednesday, that means Revelations, and we have a rather fascinating revelation for you today. So a bombshell was released last night when an accidental FBI court filing exposed the name of a Saudi official that is suspected in directly supporting the 9/11 hijackers. We're going to have a whistleblower, CIA whistleblower, and co-host of Loud and Clear, John Kiriakou, to discuss. But let's start here. You might not have known this, but there were elections that took place last night. The one specific election is one that I covered over the show the other day, making the point that it looks like the Democrat in California in an infinitely winnable race was about to lose. Basically, 25th District of California to replace Katie Hill. Now, if you remember, Katie Hill was sex-shamed out of that seat, with the Democratic Party basically abandoning her and basically her finding it untenable to maintain her position. It's unclear whether or not she committed any, let's say, malfeasance in regards to messing around with a work member, but at the very least, she was being viciously sex-shamed. And like I said, she found it untenable to maintain her position in that seat. Hill won that seat by 9 points in 2018. Clinton won that district by 7 points in 2016. Christy Smith, the person who basically beat the lefty Cenk Uygur of TYT, lost. Now, with 70% reporting last night, Mike Garcia, the Republican, 55.7% to Christy Smith, 44.3%. Understand, this is a blue district. This is in the deep blue state of California. And you have basically a Republican stomping a mud hole in the Democrat in a deep blue state of California. For whatever reason, this infinite well of enthusiasm that is radical centrism didn't necessarily catch on in order to spring Christy Smith into a better position of winning this race. Let's be very clear. When I've made these arguments about centrism and any blue will do being a killer from the standpoint of support, this is kind of what I mean. You have a district where the majority of the people in that district are Democrats. You're in a state where the majority of the people in that state are Democrats. And yet you have a Republican beating the stuffing out of a Democrat in that state. A Democrat that just so happened to be radical centrist, not backing Medicare for all, not backing the priorities of lefties in this race, and again, is in the deep blue state of California. I'm trying to make the point here that the reason that people don't vote for people like this is because people get so detached from the political system when they realize that we're in the middle of a pandemic. You have a situation where half of Los Angeles is out of a job. You have food lines that are basically lined up for blocks, and yet the best that the Democratic Party can do is run this radical centrist. Let's expand this further. It goes beyond the individual candidate about why a candidate can't necessarily win a race or the difficulties that a candidate have in that race. It goes into also the larger political party. Think for the moment of what's taking place. Nancy Pelosi passes 4 of Donald Trump's packages. These packages basically are corporate giveaways. The house is on fire, let's grab the purse. Instead of dealing with the material concerns of the public itself, they give $1,200 to the public, basically throwing pennies to the public while they loot the spot. At the exact same time, Donald Trump is overtly focused on getting the economy back up and running, and in order to do so, he is perfectly willing to use people's needs in order to force them back to work. That's not just Trump. Again, it wasn't as if the Democratic Party was pulling up any real and credible opposition to the whims and the demands of the Republican Party. They are owned by the 1% every bit as much. And in this particular case, they were on board for this policy. They were just quieter about it. After all, if the guy's going to set himself on fire and he's going to hurt his own polling, let them do so. The point I'm trying to make here is that there wasn't necessarily an affirmative case for the Democratic Party to push back against the Republican Party. Yes, there was a random lefty here or there that would make an argument that we need to give $2,000 and we need to do rent strikes. But the preponderance of the party, especially the establishments of the party, was not for that. Now, understand the effect that this has on down ballot races. The American public doesn't necessarily know who Christy Smith is. Meaning, even though she's a representative in the state, she doesn't necessarily have a high profile. And because she doesn't have a high profile, she will to some degree be defined by the Democratic Party overall. If the Democratic Party overall in the middle of a pandemic cannot show themselves and distinguish themselves from the Republican Party, that is going to look bad on the candidate who is basically running with radical centrism in the middle of a pandemic. I'm trying to make the point to you that the reason that these guys don't get those votes, the reason that people get pulled away from the political process, and believe it or not, the people who are most likely to get pulled away are people who would vote for her. Meaning, when the Democratic Party is losing these races, despite the fact that the majority of the population is basically poor, and you would think that these will be Democratic voters, well, you have a large segment of the population, 30,000 and under, an outsized influence, the majority, that don't vote. But they don't vote because they don't get enthused by radical centrism. That's kind of the point that I'm making here. You have a candidate that is running a race in deep blue California and cannot bring together a coalition to basically beat the Republican. And not just not beat the Republican, at least by the last reporting, was losing by over 10 points. Deep blue. Deep blue. You also have to blame Joe Biden for this. Joe Biden, yes, is running in his basement. And yes, Donald Trump is basically hanging himself by trying to throw open the economy against what the public wants. 70% of the public wants the economy to stay shut. Donald Trump wants the economy to get open because he was living and running on this notion of the economy being awesome. Well, the economy is no longer awesome, and he is forcibly trying to open it. This goes against the interests of the 70% of the population. Now, despite the population looking at Joe Biden and believing, believe it or not, Trump more on issues of COVID-19 than Joe Biden, who only gets like 20%, that doesn't matter. At the end of the day, Trump is going to get blamed for a large loss of life. 80,000 dead right now, 1.4 million infected. And because he's going to get infected or get blamed for that, it's not going to matter what Joe Biden does. Joe Biden is in his basement, in his PJs, and yet Joe Biden is still winning in all of these polls. And Donald Trump's polling is just getting worse and worse and worse. The problem with this, though, is even though this may be good for Joe Biden, this does not create a contrast to the Republican Party for down ballot races like this. Meaning, if you had an affirmative case that Joe Biden was running with that was enthusiastic and getting people excited, that may actually cast on races like Christy Smith and Mike Garcia, because those people would get enthused and energized and think to themselves, I need to put people in office that would benefit my candidate because I am enthused about these policies. By having Joe Biden basically running this in his basement, by basically having Nancy Pelosi just doing whatever the Republican Party wants and not providing real opposition, it adversely affects other races like Christy Smith. Bob, whether the Democratic Party realizes it or not, by not having this kind of moonshot, by not representing the interests of the public, by not pushing for like Medicare for all and these kind of expansive policies, especially in the state of California, they miss out and they lose because of such.
Yeah, I'm just laughing in my head. I was at Joe Biden.
Yeah, I'm just laughing in my head. I was at Joe Biden's final event in Iowa before the caucus, and there was a middle-aged man that was standing in front of me, and he was texting his friend and saying about the unbelievable amount of energy that was in the room. And Jamal, there was no energy in the room. There was a mumbling Joe Biden with a bad speaker. There were more media there following Joe Biden than there were supporters. There were very few young people, but yet there's so many Democrats like that guy in front of me being like, this looks great. Let's keep doing it. I love it. Let's keep pushing it. And that's what's really, it's scary, right? I mean, you create echo chambers on top of echo chambers where it's just your supporters saying, Joe Biden, you're cool. You're the guy. We love you. Go out there, and if everybody's saying that to you and you're winning, who are you to say that we should change? And I think that's what they're kind of running into, and they're going to start seeing that down ballot losses coming left and right because they're not offering anything, right? They simply thought we could be in office, we can kick this person out of office, and then we can win. And they're going to have that same sad reality that Barack Obama was in office for 8 years there with Joe Biden. And at the end of the 8 years, they had very little to show for that actually changed the material conditions of people. And now they're just going to run the same person, part of the same administration, and think that the American public are going to just fall in line with that. I think that's a bad bet to make. And if you look at the polls, Jamal, I'm kind of curious what you think here. We see that Trump is losing to Joe Biden in these head-to-head polls, but only by anywhere between 1% and 5%. That's not a huge lead that you think you would potentially open up as Trump's approval ratings go down. You would think that Joe Biden would get a few extra points, or at least that you would want to see him polling a little bit better
Donald
than
Trump
a mere
could
4 or
have
5
a
point
come
lead.
to Jesus moment and basically flip and turn this around. I mean, he is the president of the United States. He does have the bully pulpit, even though he's been having these clown car shows. Donald Trump could come out tomorrow and says, you know what, we're going to have coronavirus, Medicare for all with coronavirus. That will basically be to the left of whatever the Democratic Party is pushing.
Yeah, they've left him plenty of room
Yeah.
to the left to...
Yeah, and they've left him plenty of room to the left to tax. We'll see what that looks like tomorrow. We do need to take our first break of the hour. In the first hour of our show, we'll be talking about the police killing of an unarmed woman in Louisville, Kentucky, the U.S. efforts to support Israel annexing more of the West Bank, and the shocking spike in food cost in the midst of the pandemic. And if that's not enough, don't worry, Misfits. We have a second hour for you after that. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Political Misfits?
Political Misfits who?
Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik?
Not ringing a bell, sorry.
News, politics, culture, cutting through the red and blue spin to get to the real story? From noon to 2 p.m. Eastern at 105.5 in Washington, D.C.?
Oh, it's Bob and Jamaro. Of course, come on in.
Aren't you glad you didn't say MSNBC?
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits, the show that goes against the grain. I'm Bob Schlehuber here, sort of, kind of, with Jamarl Thomas. We continue to bring you live coverage of news, politics, and culture daily here on Radio Sputnik from 12 to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Our phone lines are open to you for the duration of our show. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. Call in with anything on your mind. For right now, though, we are going to talk a little bit about those who do not matter to U.S. imperialism, capitalism, and mainstream media. I'm talking about U.S. prisoners, America's poor, and Palestinians, to name a few. To talk about this and much more, we are joined by Dr. Dave Ragland, the Senior Bayard Rustin Fellow at the Fellowship of Reconciliation and co-founder of the Truth Telling Project. Dr. Ragland, welcome to the show.
Hey, how are you? Thank you
Good.
for having me.
Thanks for being here. It's an honor to have you on the show. You are a frequent guest of ours over at By Any Means Necessary, so I appreciate you joining Political Misfits with all of your brilliance and insights. I wanted to start here, Dr. Ragland, with the continued horrific spread of COVID-19 within American prisons. The conditions are horrific enough. In the United States, over 2 million people are kept in cages, and now we are seeing the virus decimate prison populations across the country. What caught my eye most recently was that in many cities, Dr. Ragland, official counts of those with COVID-19 have not included numbers for local prisons and homeless shelters. Here in D.C., there was data released yesterday that showed the number of cases per 1,000 residents in the neighborhoods of Brightwood Park and Brightwood were the highest in the city, with 20.4 and 16.6 cases respectively per 1,000 residents. So that in the PR and marketing and the release there looked like the highest numbers in the entire city. But below the data, there was more to be reported in smaller print that showed that the Stadium Armory neighborhood, where there's a higher rate, at 68.2 per 1,000 residents, nearly 3 times the other neighborhoods in D.C. So why does that neighborhood have such a high spike, and why wasn't it reported? Well, that's where the D.C. jail is located, which has the vast majority of concentrated cases. Dr. Ragland, those within D.C. jail are D.C. residents. They still pay taxes, they work, they live, they are a part of this city. Yet when we go to talk about the state of health and well-being, they are completely erased and made to be a footnote.
There's some people in this society that just don't matter. And like you see this like with a lot of the people who are out there on the front lines working on bail reform and prison abolition, like that we know is really rooted in a capitalistic system, like making money off of people being in prison beds. So it benefits somebody that somebody is in these jails. And, the sad thing is that, like, the people who are, like, it's not just the prisoners, it's everybody connected who's being forced into that. And I mean, in D.C., like, wherever there's a population of Black and brown people, we're going to see, like, high numbers of this, but I was just looking at the numbers of New York State, and for instance, Rikers Island, an infection rate is 6.5, which is like more than 5%, actually 6% above, the rest of New York State's population rate. So it's impossible to protect people. It shows like that. We are, as James Baldwin described, we're in a moment where we're seeing our political leaders as the moral monsters that they are. That includes the progressive, supposedly progressive politicians like Cuomo.
Yeah, and you're there in New York with Andrew Cuomo, who in the midst of this pandemic rolled back bail reform, basically keeping people in prison who can't pay to be bailed out, regardless of if they're guilty or not. And in America, they're not guilty until found guilty. So these people are presumptively innocent. But because they're poor, Andrew Cuomo has reformed and pushed back on the reforms that were to pass and basically said you have to stay in jail during this pandemic if you are poor.
Exactly. Like they, it's so interesting. Like they use this language of dangerousness, as they roll back all of the reforms that were made, and they did it like in the budget that was passed, that was used to actually deal with corona, a virus and the pandemic. That's where they used. That was the moment when they began pulling back. And what's sad is that almost taking the advice of like the conservatives and the police unions and police, policymakers who are really interested in law enforcement as reasoning to roll this back. And it just feels like, Cuomo hasn't learned from all of the stories of like Khalif Browder. They're essentially making thousands and thousands of Khalif Browders, in addition to folks who, like you said, folks who can't afford bail for whatever reason. Whole options that they created is the same thing that we were talking about, like beds full. This is an industry that makes money. This also is a society that once people go to jail, they're gone. They're not like, we don't care if they back to society. We don't care about their families worried to death. Like the death sentences for very minor infractions.
Yeah, and Jamar, I mean, to be able to do this as the United States, it's amazing how far media, the capitalist system has gone to hide these prisoners. I feel like I see more about the Uyghurs and what China is or isn't doing to the Uyghur population in Asia, and how angry people get without ever having been to China, without actually knowing the situation, not reading any of the relationships between Uyghurs and the Han population, have no idea what's going there. But you can create such an outrage in people. But here, I lived less than 2 miles from this jail here in Washington, D.C. with this horrific outbreak. My country keeps 2.5 million people in cages, and yet there is no outrage. I mean, I was saying the other day, we had fostered a dog here with my family, and putting this dog in that cage at night and seeing this dog's panic, to see the fear, and that's just a dog, let alone a human. We keep humans in cages, but yet the American public seemingly just ignores it, has been so removed from it, or has been blinded by whatever propaganda has been thrown at us that we don't actually realize the consequences of what's happening. And then now to this extra degree where COVID-19 is breaking out through the jails, it just seems like at any point to awaken some consciousness, now would be that moment.
Of the world's population, with 25% of the population of in our cages, that's an extraordinary amount of human beings to be basically dumped and thrown away in our society. I'm curious, from your perspective, as on the front lines of dealing with the issue of criminal justice and dealing with prisons and inmates, when the inmates get out and you get into things like halfway homes and everything like that, testing is also not being done in those areas. I mean, basically, they're trying to let people out early in order to deal with the prison population, in some places anyway, not necessarily everywhere. But where they're letting these people out to, this is also an issue of potentially spreading this, considering they weren't necessarily doing testing in prisons. And if prisons were harbingers or grounds for this, then you're just talking about spreading this stuff out to the society, correct?
Definitely, like communities that they're being let out into, as you said, like, they're, in my community, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri originally. I live in New York. But I've been talking to people all over the country, organizers and activists, parents and teachers and professors who, and a lot of folks I talk to are African American. Really see this is one of the ways that Black folks, brown folks are being disposed of. To zoom back out, we see. So, for instance, we see, this government, putting folks infected with corona back on the plane in Haiti. Right? You see people, not enough tests happening in our communities. Actually, one of the co-directors of the Truth Telling Project, Pastor Cori Bush, was in the hospital herself and had to beg or demand to get a test. And she's a prominent person running for U.S. Congress. So across the board, like we see people denied access to ability to protect themselves, and it feels like it feels genocidal. It feels also like Bob, what you described, this kind of separation that people don't actually know. Like one of the articles that was talking about the longest held women in jails. Like author was writing about how the data that came out of the prisons didn't include racial information, how long, like the information that people need to actually help and deal with people coming out. So it was very insidious, and this is I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I also an African American man who seen the U.S. government or medical institutions test on Black folks, like all kinds of things that we've seen and we know. Yeah. And this is just another chance deal with what W. Du Bois described as problem. W. Du Bois was asked to write about a Philadelphia neighborhood. And one of the things that he said is that Black folks are always described by their problems, right? And not as a people with problems rooted in the social concerns emerging from whatever, right? But of color are deemed and viewed as a problem, as opposed to a problem as a result of the rest of society's ignorance, willful ignorance, and exploitation of them and profiting from them.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely correct. And here in Washington, D.C., just to speak to your last point there, it's a constant conversation of what's wrong with poor people's education, what's wrong with brown and Black people's education. And for me, it's always about what are we teaching young white children that are growing up to be imperialists, colonizers, capitalists, that continue to treat people through racism, misogyny, and sexism. And you're saying to yourself, well, maybe if we fix the education system for the white kids, they want to grow up to perpetuate these vast inequalities, but everything's framed around what the Black kids are doing wrong in our school system. Yeah, I was amazed at the blaming of Black people, Jamar. There was an article in the Washington Post that I think we talked about here on the show the other day, but criticizing the council member from Southeast Washington, D.C., an all-Black community. And he had basically said, I'm not too sure about a vaccination, if I would recommend that for people to COVID-19. And the Post was basically kind of pushing it like crazy Black people. Here they are with their theories again about medicine, and they're all concerned. And we've had doctors on our show saying that if a vaccination comes out in the next month, there's no way to know whether or not it's safe or people should take it because it hasn't been gone through a lot of the clinical procedures that most drugs need to. So there's a general fear for all of people. And then Dr. Ragland's basically saying, well, look at history. We should be skeptical. But there the media is. How dare those poor Black people be skeptical of the system?
They're so shallow in the way they analyze this stuff. A vaccine that is just hurried into production, I don't necessarily think it's naive, or I don't necessarily think it's insane to look at that and think to yourself, yeah, maybe that's not the safest thing on the planet, and I would rather a few, million people get it before I expose myself to it. So I don't think it's crazy.
Well, let the Washington Post writer, the white guy at the Washington Post, Paul Schwartzman, let him take the vaccination. Let's all wait a few months and then see how he feels. But that's never going to be the case, right? Like, he's not going to be the first one because he can stay in his house. He can stay home. He's still getting paid to be a reporter. All of those don't factor into his analysis of when he goes to write the article.
The VA, if I'm not mistaken, has been potentially using medications and testing those medications on people not necessarily knowing whether those medications are accurate. Tell me if I'm wrong on this. Am I correct on this?
Yeah.
I mean, I believe it. I believe it. I mean, and I mean, it's just. I mean, here's the thing. Like, what you all are pointing out is just like kids are educated to be blind to anybody but themselves. Like, white kids, white people are educated to continue. You know, like at a certain age, they call it ego. What is it? Egoism. Egotism, like childhood egotism, like toddlers have it. My toddler has it, right? And white people are allowed to grow up and live in this society, like people egotism, right? This Eurocentric perspective, and that's nothing new, right? And we continue to hear about it, but it's not just something that happens blindly. It is a series of policy choices that are really explicit, that say, all right, there's less political fallback if we don't buy testing for this community. There's less, political fallback, or these are gonna still, buy my product. We buy this and not that for this community. And we saw this with all of these the police who were or continue to these traffic enforcement in Black and brown community when they don't do it in white communities. I mean, I think that sadly, white supremacy is what we're dealing with, and there's not enough analysis and discussion around, ways that Black people, brown people are being exploited in this moment. What it's going to do to this entire country.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to mention briefly, as you referred to her, Arena Pretty, Maryland's longest incarcerated woman, has spent 42 years of her 60-year sentence behind bars for a violent crime that she was there for. And I just mentioned this, as you had said there, Dr. Ragland. She has now tested positive for COVID-19, and 2 governors have denied her parole despite the parole boards recommending her. And so it is this really weird and fascinating system, sickening, disgusting human decisions to keep somebody locked in a cage despite her having committed a crime over 42 years ago. And she was involved at the time in a murder that she wasn't the actual killer for. But we're keeping 60-year-olds in prison who have COVID-19, who committed crimes 42 years ago. What's the point of that system? I don't quite get it. So if you're in Maryland, look up more about Arena Pretty, and please call your elected officials and demand that she is freed. We have a caller on the line. DJ, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Nice, as always, to hear your voice. What's on your mind today?
Yeah, just an answer to one of the questions. You said, what are we teaching white kids that we're not teaching to children of color, brown children? And I think it's honestly the Constitution. I think that not just the Constitution, the Declaration, and being honest, Declaration of Independence inspired all of the laws in the Constitution. And the Declaration of Independence also instructs to remove tyrannical behavior with violence. It actually says that you have a responsibility as a citizen, that when we create these partisan issues and we try and demonize people, when you look at Michigan, those people that are going around with those guns, even if you don't agree with any of the what they represent, they are exercising their constitution. I think when you have people, when they put their foot down, we talk about it all the time. What happens when you stand up to a bully? If you feel like you're being mistreated, do something about it. Black people permit this behavior, and those are my personal beliefs. When you look at vaccinations, and you look at the Tuskegee experiments, and you look at all these things, of course you're going to look at that with some sort of skepticism. But if you allow people, if you let them push this legislation on you, laws that are definitely going to come, that's the way I see it, where it says you have to take this or you're not going to be able to go to work, or your kids won't be able to go to school. And you tell them, if you fight, if there's the risk of the threat of violence, and just constitutional violence.
Yeah.
No, that's all.
DJ, thank you so much for your call. Dr. Ragland, in 1787, Thomas Jefferson must be.
Are you guys?
Jamal
Can you
talk.
guys hear me?
Took
Okay.
DJ's call.
Oh, we might have just lost.
Yeah.
Flashed out. You said
Dr. Ragland, are you still here?
I'm here. I'm here. You hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. What did you think there of DJ's call?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes. Jamaro, we had DJ's call there. We'll get Dr. Ragland figured out there. Basically saying that the U.S. Constitution is not taught over and across the board to all folks because there's a lot in the Constitution that is basically talking about the need to overthrow governments, to have militias, to be a voice of power and a check on the government. And if that's not taught to black people, they're told to be peaceful, don't speak up, know your place.
You know, one of
it's
the most
a good way to
fascinating
keep the
conversations
populace
that I heard
quieted.
from James Baldwin. James Baldwin, one of my favorite lecturers. And Baldwin made the point that, you know, we're talking about integration, we're talking about bringing people together. Well, we were already integrated. You just weren't necessarily paying attention to the laws that would have treated human beings equally. So, you know, I agree with you, Bob. I think we have the doctor.
Dr. Ragland, are you there with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I agree. Like, yeah. So I think, you know, what comes to mind for me is there's a book called Founding Brothers, and I agree. Like, we aren't teaching. I mean, so I think first of all, there's a lot of historical revisionism. For instance, the New York Times did a study over or looking at how the state of Texas is the largest textbook manufacturer or ordering textbooks. So they can essentially, Texas can write history for kids. And what some of the things that they're saying is that slaves were transported or workers who were transported as opposed to brought in chains. And then Joe Ellis, he writes a book called Founding Brothers, Joseph Ellis. And in it, you know, he describes like how at the Constitutional Congress, they essentially like agreed, that generation of founders agreed to not disclose that they had long, in-depth, rigorous conversations about slavery, whether it was moral or immoral. And they agreed to wait till that generation died. So what this sets up is like a deep silence around our founding documents and around like what we believed was given, like just that Black people were 3/5 a human, right? Things like that. And what this also sets up is like a continued like silence and lapse and like people actually knowing and understanding like truth and being able to, in the absence of truth, like, you know, create disinformation so that people can be satisfied and okay with violating human rights because they profited from it. And then like they, you know, 10 years later when the report comes out, like they can be like, oh, if only I knew, you know, I would have voted. You know what I mean? So I think that our society sets up, you know, this kind of separation where we don't have the information and this kind of absence of information where there's willful ignorance around it and people don't know what's going on. And with Trump, like this administration, like there's all kinds of disinformation and disavowal and not acknowledging truth that's coming out. So
yeah, and some places in the world, I want to make a slight hard pivot to some places where the truth is coming out from the Trump administration, and that's in Israel, where the Trump administration and Mike Pompeo are helping continue to push for the annexation of the West Bank. U.S. Secretary of State Dr. Regland, Mike Pompeo, was in Israel today meeting with King Benjamin Netanyahu. I'm just going to call him King from now on at this point. I don't know if he's ever going to leave power, and his co-vice power sharing something or another, Benny Gantz. The meeting talked about a range of different things, including China's role within Israel and the always menacing Iran. But on top of the list of topics was Israel's continued annexation of the West Bank. The State Department has in recent weeks sought to downplay the Trump administration's role in shaping Israel's annexation plans. Mike Pompeo in April said, that's an Israeli decision. There's some of your fake news right there. But who is mapping the committee? You got it. A bunch of American and Israeli officials, not including Palestinian leaders, are drawing the boundaries of the roughly 30% of the West Bank territory that is expected to be annexed. The EU obviously had some strong words, but little action, pushing back, and they'll meet on Friday to decide what exactly this violation of international law means for Europe. I thought a quote here from some of the reports was interesting. Israela Oran, a retired Israeli general and two-state solution supporter, said, quote, the question is how come annexation is so urgent in the middle of the corona pandemic and the economic crisis? The simple answer is the upcoming election in the U.S. Dr. Regland, more Palestinian land is being taken, more Palestinians are being silenced, and here we are again in the middle of a pandemic, and the U.S. is insisting on focusing on politics over people, just like we've ignored our political prisoners and prisoners here in the U.S.
I think this, Kimberly Crenshaw on a video I attended the other day, actually like describing how pandemic has been a place for our political system to avoid doing so many things in the light that are happening. And, this is absolutely, what has been on the table for a while. Like you have Pompeo saying back in 2019, he doesn't think it's illegal for them to annex the West Bank, when we know, this flies against even State Department rules held since 1978 that all of the settlements were illegal. And this is just colonialism continuing, to create a Jewish state and Palestinians. What disturbs me so much is that how our world has no choice, to a large extent, but be silent when everyone is dealing with coronavirus pandemic, while people are being kicked out of their homes, and this continued genocide and expelling of Palestinians from their land continues to occur. It is horrific. And I just have to keep saying and being outraged by it and shout that, living among moral monsters, and this whole power sharing agreement, it baffles me why the only thing, no laws can be passed in Israel under this power sharing agreement for 6 months, apparently, except annexation. So someone's profiting, China's in the mix, it's horrific.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jamar Thomas, we just have about 30 seconds left, but basically here the European Union saying this is in serious violation of international law and we're prepared to act accordingly. I'm pretty sure at this point the United States is not going to be stopped by the EU or any other power to be in the world, and they're surely not going to be slowed down by COVID-19.
At this point, the European Union didn't get involved when the JCPOA was basically shot in the face. The European Union didn't get involved as more and more land was expropriated from Israel. I have a hard time believing they're going to get all that involved now.
Really sad, horrific continuation of longstanding traditions there with the American elected officials going over there and backing the Israeli government no matter what. With that, though, we are out of time with Dr. Dave Ragland. Dr. Ragland, you do quite a bit. Where can people find more of you and all of your projects online?
I would say look at me, find me on Twitter, Instagram, at the Ragland page. Same thing. And then I'll be posting on my blog, theraglandpage.com, soon. So thank you all.
Thank you. That was Dr. Dave Ragland, the Senior Bayard Rustin Fellow at the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the co-founder of the Truth Telling Project. He's also involved in the We Stay Woke podcast, one of my favorite podcasts out there. With that, we do need to take a quick break. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. So where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Ha! Do you have access to a radio? Yeah, it's me, Max Kaiser. I'm here with Stacey Herbert. We have a new show on Sputnik called Double Down. It's business, finance, economics, ka-ching, bling, and everything in between. That's Double Down on Sputnik. Tune in.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I am here with my co-host Bob Schlehuber. Give us a call at 202-521-1320 if you guys are digging this content, anything that we've spoken about up to this point or whatever else is on your mind. Your engagement on the show is amply appreciated, and you guys help make this show what it is. So definitely smash that like button and share this content. So basically, Democrats have given Republicans everything that they've wanted over the last few months in the midst of this particular pandemic, with the public getting pennies of $1,200 while basically trillions are given to the corporate and the owner class. But the Democratic Party is not sitting down on this. They have passed what they call a Rooseveltian, or pushing a Rooseveltian plan, an FDR-style plan, in order to bring back America, bring it back to its axis, and deal with the material concerns of the population. So, Bob, I'm going to dig into this particular plan. I have to be honest, in order to call this an FDR plan, this is modest from the standpoint of the FDR plan, and in no way touches the New Deal. But let's go through a few of the things.
I wanted to play Let Me Guess Which Ones Are Actually Real and Not Real, and sadly I feel like all of these are real
You've
things.
given Republicans everything, and now you're putting out this showboat of a plan. This plan is meant to be seen. I don't believe this plan is meant to be passed. I don't think this plan has any chance of being passed at all. But basically, it's an 18,000-page plan, $3 trillion coronavirus relief bill that the Democrats are calling their heroes plan because, you know, they care about the frontline, quote-unquote, heroes. In summary, this is CNBC. Nearly $1 trillion of relief for state and local governments, a second round of direct payments of $1,200 per person and up to $6,000 for a household, about $200 billion for hazard pay for essential workers who face heightened health risks during the crisis, $75 billion for coronavirus testing and contact tracing, a key effort to restart the economy, an extension of the $600 per week federal unemployment insurance benefit through January. Now, let's keep in mind, nearly 70%, at least going back last month, 70% of the people who needed that benefit wasn't getting that benefit because of haphazard systems that could not accommodate the load on those systems. Subsidies, and a special Affordable Care Act enrollment period for people who lose their employer-sponsored healthcare coverage. I love that part. You're in the middle of a pandemic, And the best that they can do is give subsidies and early enrollment for Obamacare. I love that. More money for Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, including a 15% increase in the maximum benefit. Measures designed to buoy small businesses and help them keep employees on the payroll, such as $10 billion in emergency disaster assistance grants and strengthen employee retention tax credit. That's a mouthful. Money for election safety during the pandemic and provisions to make voting by mail easier, and relief for the Postal Service, something that they haven't done over the course of God knows how many years. Bob, this is not the Rooseveltian plan we were promised, was it? It doesn't sound like it.
No, I didn't. No, and this is my problem with the Democrats and all of their leadership. And I mean, let me take it's for me, it's the idea of having bold, creative, and new solutions to, again, go back. Like, the best we can come up with is a 90-year-old plan that we're going to dust off and kind of like basically update. That's not inspiring. That's not leadership. That's not motivation. I mean, I think John F. Kennedy said we're going to send somebody to the moon. That sounded like a cool idea, and I'm sure plenty of people had come up with it. But how exactly do you then carry that out? And how do you have the vision, the innovation, the creativity to come up with those plans and then get the ball rolling? The Democrats can simply come up with stuff that they already have been pushing, they already know about, and then are repackaging it as this bold, brand new thing. We're at a political moment, Jamarl Thomas, that has not been seen in my lifetime, your lifetime, or anybody since 1917's lifetime. Right now is the time to push forward those bold new ideas and reshape and restructure this country in ways that protect us from climate change, that address the mass poverty that we're seeing. And yet at the end of the day, it's $600 per week for unemployment. That's $700 less a month than the average two-bedroom apartment costs you in Washington, D.C.
Figure out how to ensure that people couldn't double dip. Meaning, me working here for Sputnik would get a $1,200 check in addition to me being employed here. However, they were trying to ensure that people who were, let's say, receiving unemployment benefits weren't able to like double dip with the benefits. It was really weird in the things that they were focusing on. It was so bizarre. And just to make another basic point, why do you believe they're doing this now? Meaning they've done 4 plans where they did not care one iota about the public's concerns and about the public needs and everything else. Why do you think Nancy Pelosi at this moment has gotten with her leadership and putting this particular plan out after they've given Republicans everything that they wanted in the last 4 plans?
I think to some degrees is that one, they had more time to actually. I think to some degrees is that one, they had more time to actually realize they needed to put something out, and 2, I think the Republicans were just gutting so much and getting such huge wins that at some point they needed to push back and put this out. I mean, the relief for U.S. Postal Service, that's not going to solve the problem of the U.S. Postal Service in this crisis, the new Solicitor General there. But I was reading a story here yesterday in Washington, D.C., where in the poorest parts of the city, they haven't had enough people to actually staff the postal routes. And a lot of people on the Postal Service are getting sick. And so, again, all of these measures, as you're mentioning, are coming way after the fact, way beyond when they should have been addressed. And in many ways, the Democrats are going to try to address things that are beyond fixing at this point. Simply allowing people to enroll in Obamacare is not going to help the hundreds of thousands of people that have COVID-19 at this moment. They're sick in hospital beds, or they're slowly dying or quickly dying, at home. Getting access to medical care and being able to have an enrollment period is not the issue that they're focused on right now.
We're talking about like 33 million people without a job. I think we're talking about 30 million people without health care. And their response is, okay, we're going to give you Obamacare and give you subsidies to cut the costs. It's like, yeah, okay. Speaking of intractable problems, Fed Chair Powell said coronavirus downturn could be long-lasting if Congress doesn't act. The Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell warned today that without more help, the United States could end up mired in a multi-year painful recession. Additional fiscal support could be costly, but worth it if it helps avoid long-term economic damage and leaves us with a stronger recovery. Powell said in a video conference with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. He urged Congress to remember that the longer people remain out of work, the deeper the scarring becomes on the U.S. economy. There is a domino effect where consumers lose jobs and sharply cut spending and can cause more businesses to close, hurting more jobs. Companies that go out of business also stop paying their suppliers, which can drag down other firms. It seems like consumer spending is the underpinning of the whole house of cards. And if you want to save, then you need to give consumers money so those consumers can spend. Basically, you need to give that money to the bottom part of the economy, something that they have decided not to do if you want those people spending money into the economy in order for that to grow it up. Am I missing something, Bob?
No, I mean, I think you're right, but I think the economy is based on debt. Like, the idea is to basically force people into giving you everything that you have now and well into the future. And obviously, capitalism is predicated on recycling money through the system. That's why you have mortgages are so critical, car payments, other long-term college debt. All of those are so crucial to the system, and basically being able to milk people dry, that just giving people money is never the goal. It's basically committing people to interest rates and long-term schemes that force them into certain economic models. And so again, the capitalist system that is designed in one way is not going to be rescued by the broken design that it's designed around. You know, I mean, it needs brand new whole systems change to it to be able to save it. And yet they just, I don't know if I got to assume these economists are capable, Jamar, that they know that there's alternative economic models out there, but I just think they operate in such a way that they only know they only use their one system, and that system's crumbling, and yet they're then trying to save that system with the same crumbling system.
Well, to hammer everything
doesn't
looks
make
like
sense
a nail,
when I say it, and it doesn't make sense in
Basically, they don't want to
practicality.
deal with any other system. Powell, all of these people have been massively enriched by the system. So you would imagine all powers at their disposal are going to be put to bear in order to keep the system going however they can. I mean, even the Green New Deal is basically an expansion of the capitalistic system by trying to clean up the mess that private enterprise made by basically government spending. I mean,
yeah, and nobody at home right now out of a job like made money, right? Like, we don't have money trees that we're not cultivated money trees, people. The money is there; it can be given to people, and we've talked a little bit about monetary policy here on the show. That there's ways that the U.S. government can continue to print money, get it out to people, it can spend, and it can uphold the economy. But people just don't want to use that economic model, and they're stuck, in my opinion.
People not necessarily having access to their ends. Grocery prices are going up. So grocery prices shot up last month in the biggest increase in 50 years. Now, put this in perspective. You're in the middle of a pandemic. You're at the point where they're killing chickens or killing, making sure that those chickens can't necessarily get pregnant and killing the babies of those chickens because they don't necessarily have enough people to take the inventory. Simultaneously, we have a meat shortage. I don't know how both of these things are functioning at the exact same time, but nevertheless, it's there. They're getting rid of milk, and during the meat shortage, Donald Trump is forcing these people to go back to work during the course of the shortage. Like, it's the most bizarre thing that both of these things are taking place at once, where there's a surplus and apparently, simultaneously, not enough to go around. It's really bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you had 10 chickens that you usually sold and you're only able to sell 5 of them now, you double the price of those 5 to get the same profit on those 10s. But again, it's capitalism run amok. We have millions of seniors that are stuck at home. We have restaurants that are closed. And so small farms and farms across America have nowhere to deliver that food. But yet again, you're just looking at your bottom line, Jamar, and it says we need to make money, right? Jack up the price.
Something becomes scarce, or the moment something becomes difficult, you jack up the price. But the weird part to this kind of goes back to my point about the oddity of this. Let me just read it. Grocery prices shot up last month in their biggest increase in 50 years. Meat prices and egg prices, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, consumers paid 4.3% more for meats, poultry, fish, and eggs, 1.5% more for fruits and vegetables, and 2.9% more for cereals, bakery goods, the Labor Department said. The increase in cereals and bakery products was the biggest increase ever recorded in 100 years of maintaining this data. And this is in the middle of a crisis where you have 30 million people out of a job. Put that in perspective. Overall, consumers paid 2.6% more in April for groceries, the largest one-month jump since February 1974, the Washington Post reports. At the same time, the overall consumer price index fell by 0.8% last month, the biggest single drop in 12 years. So weird.
Yeah, and Jamar, it's so extra frustrating that the government increases SNAP benefits from people at the same time then grocery stores are jacking up the prices, which basically offset the benefit and support to people. So that's your capitalist system working hand in hand with the government to be as inefficient as possible. Jamar, with that, we are at the end of our first hour of news, politics, and culture. We head now to our second hour where we'll talk more about the unraveling of Russiagate going unnoticed in the time of COVID-19. how the rich are looking to steal money from you and your future self. And in our Revelation segment, the FBI accidentally reveals a Saudi's official name and with suspected ties to 9/11 attacks in the U.S. With that, we take a quick break. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. My name is Jamal Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Bob Schlehuber. We have a loaded hour coming up, a loaded second hour for you guys coming up. If you guys are digging what we're putting down, be sure to smash that like button and share this video. Also, your engagement makes the show what it is, so definitely feel free to send chats, texts, or give us a call at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Now, it's no secret that we're on a Russian station, Sputnik Radio, and I, over the past 3 years, even before getting on the station, had taken a keen interest in the whole Russiagate saga. I disbelieved the Russiagate saga because I believe everybody in the process had a dog in the hunt. Not so much that it was impossible for it to be true, but more so that the evidence wasn't forthcoming despite all of the assertions that they had the evidence. If the Trump and Russia saga wasn't dead, the series of releases over the past week or so in any reasonable world would have definitely killed it. Unfortunately, this is not a reasonable world. We had CrowdStrike. Now, the CrowdStrike one was interesting because Sean Henry, the president of CrowdStrike, comes out and basically says, we have no evidence. Tells Adam Schiff this, tells many other congressional members this was in a congressional record that was only released like last week. This is going back all the way to 2017. We have no evidence that anything was pulled from the DNC, meaning we don't know that anyone took emails from the DNC. It looks like they might have, but we don't necessarily have evidence attesting that anything was quote-unquote exfiltrated. The other item that was a bombshell came regarding Flynn. Basically, it was released that the FBI agents had already viewed the conversation between Flynn and Kislyak. Now, this was the unmasking procedure, where they were able to know that Flynn was the person on the other end of that phone call, meaning the FBI, the intelligence services under the Obama administration, whether Obama was implicated or not, it's not entirely clear at this point, but were basically viewing conversations of the incoming administration. When Flynn was brought in for that meeting, they made it as if Flynn was just having a regular meeting, not necessarily that he was going to be ambushed. When the written notes basically have the agents asking themselves, are we going to get him arrested or are we going to get him fired? Nothing that Flynn had did up to that point was illegal. Nothing that Flynn did up to that point was wrong, meaning the conversation that the FBI had with Flynn was entirely there in order to find something to get him hooked on. Meaning they brought Flynn in for a perfectly legit conversation, meaning the conversation he had with Kislyak. And they went into conversations or questions on something that they already knew. Meaning the only reason you would have that conversation with Flynn is if you were looking to get Flynn on something, not that Flynn had already did something. The purpose of the FBI's meeting was to get Flynn hooked, not because Flynn did anything. I hope you understand there's a difference in those things. To discuss, we're joined by author and human rights lawyer Dan Kovalik. His most recent book is No More War. Kovalik, I apologize. Kovalik, Dan Kovalik.
Kovalik.
His most recent book is No More War, How the West Violates International Law by Using Humanitarian Intervention to Advance Economic and Strategic Interests. Dan, welcome to the show. How are you today? As we're doing okay, hunker down, but we're doing all right.
How are you guys?
So, is my general explanation of the Flynn saga accurate? And is there anything else you would add to it? And to piggyback one more question on that, whatever anyone thinks of Flynn or Barr, was this a good ruling?
The ruling to dismiss the charges, I think so. I wrote a book actually in 2017 about Scapegoat Russia, which was a book that challenged the narrative of the Russiagate saga. And even at that time, it was clear to me that Flynn had done nothing wrong. He was part of a transition team. The transition team of an incoming president often meets with counterparts from other countries to prepare to take office, right? I mean, you only have November of the election year and January of the next year, a few months, to prepare to, take the role as one of the most significant leaders on earth, right? And so makes sense that you would talk to different countries, and that's what exactly happened here. And so, as you know, there was nothing in terms of the substance of what Flynn was doing to justify charges. And so the FBI basically, without telling him that he was under investigation or that he was a target, essentially just tried to get him on to trip him up into not telling truths to them. And they do that all the time. Again, if they have a target they want to get and they have nothing on them, and they just try to get them for lying or whatever. But as the decision to drop the charges made clear, in order for the lying to be the basis of a crime, it has to be lying about something of a material basis that itself would be a criminal, right? It's and there is no criminality here. He was doing his job as an incoming,
and basically, just so we're clear,
White House
he basically
official.
tells Pelosi,
Look,
don't overstress the sanctions. We'll deal with it when we get in. Now, they tried to get him on some law that was never basically used, the Logan Act. In reality, as you make the point, nothing that he did was improper. All of these things were just part and parcel to a transition team going into office. The FBI had nothing on him, and instead, they brought him in order to create something, not because they had anything. I just want to nail that down to the audience, correct?
No, that's absolutely right. In the Logan Act, no, that's absolutely right. In the Logan Act, which I believe is no one's ever been prosecuted under the Logan Act, it essentially says that private individuals are not allowed to conduct the foreign policy of the United States, which makes sense, right? I can't be like Juan Guaido in Venezuela and go to Russia and say, hey, I represent, how are you? Let's make a deal, right?
Yeah, and Dan, just to interject here, the 1799 law you're referencing, I was angry in 2015, if people remember. Tom Cotton, along with 46 other sitting U.S. senators, Republicans, wrote a letter to Iran's leaders. There, again, you're not supposed to, as a sitting elected official, not in the White House, to do direct outreach to a foreign entity. So it's been very blatantly disregarded in very amplified public ways. And here in a situation where obviously every administration incoming into the White House starts to transition, is reaching out to foreign leaders, to diplomats, to different contacts around the country. The fact that they even use this as a premise is absolutely absurd, but nobody actually reads the details of this to see what they were going after Flynn in the first place.
Exactly. So he, at that point, was a White House official elect. No. And as you point out, and they always talk about the transition room and the keys to the transition room, they were in transition. And they did what every transitional official does, and they start putting their ducks in a row. And again, we should want them to do that. We do not want the most nuclear-armed state in the world start fresh on January 20th without having talked to any of our friends and adversaries. It's absurd, right? And that's why this was always a tempest in a teapot. Why, and again, I'm not a fan of Michael Flynn. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump. But look, Flynn was not doing anything wrong. He was doing his job.
Of domestic politics, I've argued for international politics that international law doesn't exist. And considering that you're a lawyer dealing with human rights, you're the perfect person to have this conversation with. Now, the reason why I say international law doesn't exist is because for countries like the United States, the U.S. literally invaded Iraq, killed 1 million people. We were perfectly okay with starting revolutions, or not revolutions, coups, or attempted coups, either in Syria, which got 500,000 people killed, or Libya, where they're now selling slaves. Not to mention the foreign policy that was taking place in South America, where we were knocking over governments, killing elected leaders, and so forth. No consequences for this, even for Israel. So I guess I'm making the point that international law seems to only really apply for smaller countries that don't have nuclear arsenals, which means that international law doesn't exist. Now, in this policy, where the EU is saying, being more boisterous and pushing back on what the United States and the annexation in regards to Israel, does the EU have anything that they can actually do in order to push back against the annexation in Israel?
Well, the answer is as following. First of all, I do teach international human rights, which of course is based on international law. And look, I think maybe it's a matter of semantics. Certainly international law exists. International law that the U.S., for example, is a party to, and in fact helped to develop over time, beginning with the UN Charter after World War II. At the same time, I agree with you that as things have progressed or degressed, the major powers, again, I would say U.S. first and foremost, acted like and taken the position that international law applies to everyone but itself. And that in the end, as you say, international law is applied only against the poor and the weak, not against the strong. And of course, as we know, people talk about this all the time, a law only works if no one is above the law, right? If it affects the rich and the strong as much as the poor and the weak. But that is not true for international law, not because there isn't an international law, but because there's not strong enforcement mechanisms, particularly because main enforcement mechanism under the UN Charter is the Security Council. And that gets to your question, what can the EU do to confront Israel's annexation of the West Bank, which also means confronting the U.S., which, bankrolls Israel and is its biggest patron. And the answer is, in practice, not a whole heck of a lot. The real power could act up Israel is the Security Council of the United Nations, which, as we know, has only 5 permanent members. They were all allied nations, although I would argue with the exception of France, which became allied at the last minute against Nazi Germany. Of course, the U.S. being one of those members, and they have veto power. So problem with international law as it exists is that the only body has any power for international peace and security by definition, by rules set forth in the UN Charter, is the Security Council. The U.S. has veto power there, and the U.S. would veto any attempt by the EU to get Security Council authorization to do something to stop the annexation.
Dan, this is Dan Kovalik. We're continuing to be joined by here on Political Misfits. Give us a call, 202-521-1320. That's 202-521-1320. You wonder in many ways, Dan, like why the U.S. continues to be a part of the United Nations if they're just going to vote and have a veto power over anything and everything that ever gets put out there. I mean, it was fascinating to see last week that the UN was trying to push kind of a global ceasefire resolution to encourage people around the world to stop killing people because the virus is doing plenty of that. And yet they basically got into a tiff with the UN over the reference of the World Health Organization and felt that it was coddling China too much. So here the United States, again, in the middle of a pandemic, is playing politics with the language of the UN. In many ways, you say, why even continue to show up? Why continue to pretend that you're going to uphold any of these laws when in reality, you're going to go it alone?
Well, I think for the very reason you say, I think the U.S. stays in the game to make sure rules continue to be enforced in its favor, right? As long as it's a permanent member of the Security Council, it can veto all those things. And so that's a very powerful position to be in. It's a purely historical accident that you have these five particular countries who were allies who have the status of permanent member. Of course, a lot of the countries of the world are balking at this, saying, that maybe those members should rotate. Okay, you won World War II. That's a good thing. But why in 2020 do you still have veto power? But again, U.S. to continue to be involved gives it that veto power. And I'll give an interesting example of how the U.S. does this sort of thing. So with the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, Bill Clinton was very active in negotiating the terms of the Rome Statute of the ICC to make it as weak as possible, and in particular to make it weak when it came to going after countries for crimes of aggression, meaning crimes for starting wars lawfully. Of course, the U.S. does that all the time. So in any case, his administration did a number of things to weaken the ICC, make sure that when it passed, it would be ineffective against countries like the U.S., and then in the end, U.S. didn't agree to the ICC anyway. So they weaken the ICC, and then they say, we're not gonna consent to it anyway. So that was effective, so that it prevents the ICC getting too out of line, even with the U.S. not
I want
being.
to jump into domestic politics for a moment. We're ensconced with the COVID-19 virus, 1.4 million people infected at this point, over 80,000 dead. Preventable, basically incompetence from the standpoint of the Trump administration. But Trump had been living on the notion of the economy, and he's been living on the notion of the economy for so long, he had that in his quiver, thinking that that was going to be the thing that ensured him the election. Well, not so much. It's hit the skids. And so Donald Trump is trying to throw open the economy all at once. And this includes meat packers, where 1,700 in Tyson were basically coming down with the COVID-19 and spreading this virus. But more to the point, what are the protections available for people and workers as they are forced back into their jobs? Because look, just because you work at a company, you should be safe in the company that you work. What are the protections available as these state and federal governments, or as the federal government and state governments try to push people back into their jobs?
Sadly, very little. Normally under OSHA and under local analogous laws, safety and health laws, only you could refuse to do work that's dangerous for those laws. And I certainly would encourage people to do that if necessary. The problem is that both the federal government and a number of states are now saying, well, if you don't go back to work in a company that's reopened, particularly if it's deemed essential, which these meat packing companies have been deemed, you can't get unemployment compensation. You don't have a protected job and you don't have unemployment compensation. They're literally forcing workers in those situations to choose possibly death by disease or death by starvation. And that is a horrible situation.
You make an extremely good point,
people.
because this becomes a political issue. And being that this is a political issue, you would think that there would be somewhat of an opposition party that's looking out for workers, and that doesn't necessarily seem the case. Democrats pushed their $3 trillion plan out, but this is after basically giving Republicans everything that they want. And I don't entirely believe that this plan is put out to be passed. I believe it's put out just to show some level of, we're being a lefty opposition, but the Republicans keep stopping us. I'm curious, you have many lefty groups that are trying to pressure the Democratic Party and the political instrument to be something else. But that doesn't necessarily seem to work, because you can always make this least worse argument, and many of these guys are not willing to go through with the level of accountability and making these guys lose. Is there anything from the standpoint of the legal system that would allow people to try to get additional parties into the political process? The Democratic Party and the Republican Party are basically just two corporations. Antitrust litigation can't be used. I know this is somewhat of a wild card, but antitrust legislation can't necessarily be used to try to shoehorn additional parties into the political process.
Sadly, no. I mean, the entire political system we have, was written, the Constitution was written to prevent majority rule. And because we have this electoral college, which prevents people from having one person, one vote, right? I mean, effectively, the guy in, Montana gets 10 votes and someone in New York gets a half a vote, given that, how the electoral system works. And because don't have proportional representation, meaning it's winner take all, it is nearly impossible to build a significant third party. And that is how the system was created. And that's why it works perfectly well. I forget who said it. But there's a great quote saying, the U.S. is a one-party state. We just have two, which is absolutely true. You basically have one party with two sides to it. One a little more humane than the other, but increasingly difference between the two parties has become less and less. I think, under Roosevelt, Kennedy, and Johnson, there were significant differences. Now it's really shades of gray at this point. And so you do have a system that really is rigged against working class people. And we saw that, of course, too, that even within the parties like the Democratic Party, saw, Sanders twice get railroaded out of, the position of nominee when frankly, he was poised to win that. Again, that is the system working, unfortunately.
So, Dan, then I'll ask the follow-up question. How do we get the system to stop working, and then how do we replace it with one led by the proletariat and the working class?
We need a revolution. I mean, in truth, we need a revolution. How that revolution would look, I don't know, but exactly. But we need a French or Russian type revolution. We can't go on like this anymore. Even you have people like Jimmy Carter, who said a couple of years ago that we do not have a functioning democracy. It's so obviously true. The pandemic has exposed that. It has exposed how inequitable our society is, how cruel it is, frankly, how genocidal it is. There was a great article in the Atlantic over the weekend, talking about how Trump was ready to do something about the pandemic till they realized who was dying from it. That's African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, poor people. And they decided that those people are expendable. And that is not a society, I think, or an economy that can be reformed. You really need revolutionary change.
Yeah, Jamal, I live here in Washington, D.C. Guess how many Congress members I have representing me in the federal government that
0?
vote on the federal budget? That's right. I got 0. That's democracy. you're upset with those people in Hong Kong who don't have democracy because they don't get. The people in Hong Kong have more of a democracy and elect more of their officials than I do here in Washington D.C. So that's American democracy.
When people ask me why did I start my channel or when did I start my channel, and I tell them I started getting angry from my analysis of history versus what I thought our country was versus what it actually was. Because what you're saying, Dan, the point that you're making is there's a disconnect between what the public needs and what the public wants. You can look at all of the policies versus what the government gives, and like cynically gives. I mean, it's not even, they don't even make any inhibitions about it. If you think back to when Ronald Reagan gave that speech, Ronald Reagan gives this famous speech talking about the Iran-Contra affair. And he basically makes the argument that, look, the buck stops with the Gipper, but I didn't know anything about it. And it became a media firestorm. Now, when Obama did basically the exact same thing in trying to topple Syria, people knew about it, nobody cared. It seems that this is kind of the argument that I make where, and Dan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, the country moves further and further and further to the right because there's no accountability in the political process. And we've gotten to the point where there's no magical door, where the political system is just detached from what the public wants.
Absolutely. I mean, there's two polls we suppose out now that demonstrate that. First of all, now 70% of the U.S. population wants Medicare for all. 70%. Yet will not have a candidate in November they could vote for who will support that. Also have a majority of Americans recently polled who say they believe we should not start to reopen the economy until numbers of infected and deaths come down significantly. They are also ignored, right? And so we're seeing life and death issues where Americans are pretty clear about what they want, and our leaders are saying, no, you can't have those things. And again, yes, it has gotten worse. Now, there were times in this country when democracy appeared possible. That was in the 30s and into the 40s to some extent, and in the 1960s. It wasn't by accident. It wasn't because our rituals were nicer then. It's because the people were demanding it. The people were on the streets. There were union movements and socialist movements and civil rights movements and peace movements that demanded these things. And that's why, I mean, if you look, for example, Nixon and Ford, they look like liberals now. They would be to the left of people like Bill Clinton and Obama, not because they were nice guys, because there were people in the streets holding their feet to the fire. And you really, by and large, don't have that. You haven't had it significantly for a long time. Of course, now it's virtually impossible during the quarantine. But I think once the quarantine is lifted, I think people will take to the streets. I forget who said it, but she expects French-type revolution here when that happens. I mean, people have to understand now how terrible our government is and how it has failed us so profoundly. All they have to know, they live in the richest country on earth, and yet the U.S. has the worst statistics in terms of the number of infected and the number of people dying from this pandemic, and those numbers continue to go up.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Dan. I don't think it's going to be soon impact this election come November, but I think we see a large economic movement that rivals Occupy Wall Street. We do have a caller on the line here. Lamont, are you here?
Yes, sir, I am. What's going on, guys?
Not much, man. We got about a minute left here. What's on your mind?
Sure, I'll make it really quick. Thank you again for taking my call. I think a part of me feels like, if we splinter off, let's say, if we could have another system to incorporate other political parties that represent like a larger range of, political ideas, let's say, I don't know that even then if that would still be enough, because I wonder to myself if those splinter off parties just won't be bought up or get sucked into the corporate interest, just like we're seeing now. Okay. So I wonder that, but then, I start to think that, we need to refocus these things, because instead of refocusing on the corporate interest, I think, we need to refocus back on the people, make this, and so in other sense, strengthen the economic system, and then by extension, that'll influence the political system. You see, and I only say that because I wonder, if that's things need to be refocused, because I think it's stuck in the economic system and then it kind of branches out. But we have this tendency that it's vice versa, And then just to kind of draw my point home a little more, is that we vote on the school board, like school council elections. We can have a vote on this and that and social policies, but almost never do we ever vote on our economic system. And I'll end it at that. Thank you guys again.
Yeah, Dan Cavalli, curious your response. If we can steal an extra few minutes with you. I was laughing at watching Veep last night, and they were making jokes about how no one pays attention to the economy. People only look at the Dow Jones number as somehow being the whole idea behind the political economy, is some one number that is a composite of a bunch of big corporations in America, somehow supposed to tell us something about 330 million people's economic conditions. Curious what you made of Lamont's call.
No, of course, he's absolutely right. I mean, in this country, you're free to vote for any capitalist party you want. The economic system is not up for grabs, and that's why we need a more radical response and radical revolution to solve the problems we have, because it's the economy, the economic system, which dictates the politics in the political system, right? And so the caller was absolutely correct about that. You mentioned the stock market. I mean, the fact that the stock market has had its best month since the Great Depression, the best month in U.S. history since the Great Depression, while you have tens of millions of people unemployed, has to show you how disconnected the stock market is. But not only the stock market, but shows those who have money in this country do not care that millions of people are out of work, millions of people don't have food, millions of people are at the risk of dying, and they're still content to trade their bonds and their stocks and make a lot of money. And if the system can work for them while millions of us die, not a system that any of us should be willing to accept.
Yeah, and Jamal, it makes me just think of the people that, again, going back when I was in Iowa, the people that were voting for Pete Buttigieg, because you're looking at these people and you're like, man, you have not that much savings. You have some mutual funds that your family passed down to you. You'll get some inheritance. And ultimately, though, you're going to have student debt. You're going to have high medical costs. And yet this group of people with very little economics is pitted against poorer people, but they see themselves as being wealthier. And so it's also interesting how the politics, the marketing of U.S. politics in a way to keep people in these economic groupings then basically play off of each other, and then you actually never get to capitalism.
That allows the system to maintain where it is. Dan, I'm curious your perspective on this. I would make the case that over the course of time, by not putting accountability in the political process, that's had a secondary effect that goes beyond just the people who you put in the office. It also goes into what the public believes is possible in their political space. Bob made mention to Kennedy saying, we're going to the moon. And basically not having the technology to necessarily do it, but figuring out how to do it. The vision in and of itself was the thing that was important in order to prioritize the actions of the people in the society and create a focal point in regards to what they were going to do. Well, by going for the last 40 years, when Sanders is running that race saying we're going to have Medicare for all, and we're going to pass expansion of Social Security and getting rid of student debt, and the public is like, yeah, we've never seen you do that. Meaning, by not having an actual example that the public can go to and point to and say, we've seen government take substantial action in order to deal with the rough edges of our system. By not having that example, you've effectively created a situation where people have a difficult time conceiving what you're talking about, even if they would agree with the policies. Am I wrong on this? Meaning this kind of failure of vision just from the standpoint of not pushing for these kind of more expansive policies?
Oh, I think that is the big problem. You have a lack of political imagination, a lack of revolutionary imagination. Now, which did exist in the 20th century a lot more. And why? Because you had revolutions happening around the world. You had the Soviet Union, which for all its faults at least represented a different model, a different way to do things. And I think that impacted people greatly. I think people were inspired by the idea of revolution then, and therefore had greater political vision and believed that a better world was possible. And I do think we now have politics of despair. People simply don't believe a better world is possible, and so they do not strive for it. And part of our duty, I think, as commentators and intellectuals, is to help reignite that political imagination again and that revolutionary imagination.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. Thank you so much, Dan. With that, we do need to leave it there. Dan Kovalik, an author and human rights and labor lawyer. Dan, where can people find more of you and your work online?
Oh, I just had a piece on Counterpunch. They can find me there. I'm also on Facebook and on Twitter at Daniel M. Kovalik.
Dan Kovalik, thank you again for joining us. With that, we take a break before coming back with our weekly Revelation segment. This week's segment is brought to you by the FBI. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik Live in D.C. We're back after this.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Tune in to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker for the latest news, commentary, and political analysis. What's really behind the political and social crisis gripping the United States and the world? Forget the spoon-fed soundbites from the pundits who know so little about so much. We bring you independent experts, analysts, and activists. Learn what really makes the decision makers take from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the West Wing of the White House. Here is where the people fighting for change speak and are heard loud and clear 5 days a week on Radio Sputnik and SputnikNews.com.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlaber here with Jamarl Thomas. That music means it's time for our weekly Revelation segment, as it is every Wednesday in the 1:30
I was thinking the same thing.
Segment. No UFOs this week, but we do have a no UFOs this week, tomorrow. But we do have a story about the FBI accidentally, maybe accidentally, we'll find out more here in a second, releasing the name of a Saudi embassy official who many believe helped two of the 9/11 hijackers. Joining us for this conversation is our good friend, CIA torture whistleblower and co-host of Loud and Clear on Radio Sputnik, John Kiriakou. John, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure to do it. Good to talk to you both.
John, let me just briefly update our listeners here who haven't had the chance to catch this story. It's a doozy. The Yahoo story here reads, the FBI inadvertently revealed one of the U.S. government's most sensitive secrets about September 11th terror attacks, the identity of a mysterious Saudi embassy official in Washington who agents suspected had directed crucial support to two of the al-Qaeda hijackers. The disclosure came in a new declaration filed in federal court by a senior FBI official in response to a lawsuit brought by families of 9/11 victims that accuses the Saudi government of complicity in the terrorist attacks. The declaration was filed last month but unsealed late last week. According to a spokesperson for 9/11 victims' families, it represents a major breakthrough in a long-running case, providing for the first time an apparent confirmation that FBI agents investigating the attacks believed they had uncovered a link between the hijackers and the Saudi embassy. Ironically here, the declaration identity, the Saudi official in question was intended to support recent filings by Attorney General William Barr and Acting Director of National Intelligence Richard Grenell, barring the public release of the Saudi official's name and all related documents, concluding they are state secrets that, if disclosed, could significantly harm national security. So Barr and Grenell did not want the name released. So what happens? The declaration that was filed that had the name unredacted was by Jill Sanborn, the assistant director of the FBI's counterterrorism division. Her declaration fleshes out some of the assertions Barr and Grenell have used in their filings, arguing the publicity of these files and the names in them would cause more damage than they would do good. So while Sanborn's 40-page declaration blacks out the Saudi official's name in most instances, in one it failed to do so, a discrepancy first noted by a Yahoo News reporter, the name Mossad Ahmed Al-Jarrah. John, tell us more about Al-Jarrah and what you make of this revelation.
Yeah. Well, Mossad Al-Jarrah was a mid-level Saudi diplomat in the Saudi embassy here in Washington. He was a second secretary. He was early mid-career, but he was the official who was the representative of the Saudi Ministry of Islamic Affairs. Now, the Ministry of Islamic Affairs is a controversial ministry, even in Saudi Arabia, because its job is to finance the construction and manning of mosques around the world and Islamic centers, Islamic schools. We have plenty of them here in the United States, especially in the Washington area. And they also are in charge of distributing Qur'ans in prisons around the world for prisoners who are Muslims or who are considering converting to Islam in prison. The problem with that is the Quran has on one side the actual Quran, the words of the Quran, and on the other side is the commentary that explains what the Quran means. Well, the commentary is from very, very conservative, fundamentalist even, Saudi commentators. So this is a way for Saudi Arabia to proselytize its ultra-conservative brand of Islam around the world. That was Mossad Al-Jarrah's job. Now, what we know, what we knew before this revelation was that there was somebody in the Saudi embassy who was in contact with cutouts or middlemen who in turn were in contact with the hijackers, or at least two of the hijackers who at the time were in Los Angeles, California. There was a revelation several years ago that the wife of the Saudi ambassador to Washington, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, sent $50,000 to the cutouts, and that $50,000 made its way into the bank accounts being used by the 9/11 hijackers. So already there was this air of conspiracy, let's call it, that the Saudi royal family, or at least the Saudi ambassador, was involved in financing the 9/11 attacks. Well, now here we have this mid-level bureaucrat who was in charge of liaising with the 9/11 cutouts. Can't do that on your own. No diplomat in any embassy can undertake such an operation on his own. That had to have done with the permission of the ambassador, and in turn with the permission of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or at least the intelligence service.
So, John, tell me more about why Barr and Grenell were so eager to prevent the release of the name. Why was that so important to that name to not be out there, to them, to this administration, decades later?
You know, this is really, to me, the interesting part of this story. Since the Franklin Roosevelt administration, we've had what has become known as a special relationship with Saudi Arabia. We love the Saudis. The Saudis love us. We support each other in the United Nations. And all of that really is nonsense. It's always been nonsense. The Saudis buy our weapons and we buy their oil. That's the extent of the relationship. Otherwise, we don't even particularly like each other very much. I told a story on my own show. My first overseas tour when I was with the CIA was to Saudi Arabia in the immediate aftermath of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And I was very excited to get there. And when I got there, every Saudi I encountered, to a man, every Saudi was actively hostile, actively rude to me. And finally, I challenged a guard outside the American embassy, and I said, "What's your problem?" And he looked at me dead in the eye, and he said, "You are hired help. He paid you to come here and guard the oil fields. We are not friends." And he was right. We're not friends. We've never been friends. This is a business relationship and nothing more.
And then I'm curious here. Do you think there's anything? Did this FBI agent basically just make a mistake? Would there be any reason she would want to release it? And then why was there such controversy in the internal fighting taking place at the FBI?
Yeah, isn't that a crazy development? I don't think this was an accident. You know, when documents are being classified, like this document was declassified, not exaggerating when I tell you that 20 different people are involved. 20 different people take a chop on this thing, and they all have a Sharpie in their hand. So what we're supposed to believe here is that 20 different people missed the name Ada. And that just doesn't make any sense at all. There are so many editorial layers here, and not just editorial, but security, to make sure that these names are not made public. The fact that one slipped through 20 different editorial layers just doesn't make any sense to me. I think the more likely scenario is that one inside the FBI at a relatively senior position, and it may be this Special Agent Sanborn, who's in charge of counterintelligence, just finally came to the conclusion that it doesn't make sense for us to keep protecting the Saudis. You know, the Saudis, or I should say Saudis, slaughtered 3 million people that day. Why do we keep covering for them? Don't the American people have a right to know, or at least the families of the surviving family members of the victims of 9/11? Don't they have the right to know? I think they do. And, you know, there's another thing, too. There was a comment that President Trump made, an offhanded comment to Melania, when he was told that two former FBI directors, Robert Mueller and Jim Comey, both insisted that Ada's name be kept secret. Trump turned to Melania and said, "You see, Melania, the same scum that are attacking me want this name to be secret." Called them scum. So I'm wondering if this is one of those quintessential Washington leaks, like the accidental, non-accident kind of leak, where somebody decided at a policy level, it's time to make this thing public.
Just so we're clear, it was 3,000 that were butchered on 9/11. John, I'm curious, and welcome to the show. I always appreciate when you come on to the show. Hillary Clinton at one point in one of the WikiLeaks disclosures made reference to Saudi Arabia being instrumental in basically spreading terrorism throughout the globe, saying they spend basically billions on it. The Ministry of Islamic Affairs, is that basically what you're referring to? Is that what she was referring to? That basically they put a ton of money into these, let's say, mosques, and you may have some mosques that are more, let's say, PG, but you have other mosques that are far more conservative in their particular ideology, and Saudi Arabia is basically funding this stuff.
Yes, they fund also NGOs and sort of launder the money through NGOs. There's one in particular called the Muslim World League, which is based in Jeddah. It's the largest of all of the Saudi-backed religious NGOs. And the ministry, it's called the Ministry of Awqaf and Religious Affairs. Awqaf is religious donations or religious charities. And so they send the money to the Muslim World League or to other Islamic organizations that they have set up. And then public loses track of the money. It's no longer governmental money. And it ends up in the hands of, well, in the past, Al-Qaeda. It ended up in the hands of separatists in countries around the world, Kashmiris, Kashmiri terrorist groups, and then it makes its way to the United States. You know, it's no accident that the fastest growing religion in Latin America is Islam. It's no accident that it's a Saudi-backed mosque, for example, in Guatemala, that is feeding half of Guatemala City. That's how they attract people. That's how they get them into the mosque. There's a nice hot dinner, and by the way, why don't you listen to this sermon that we've prepared for you? That kind of thing. When you're in prison and you're angry at the government for locking you up and taking you away from your family, you pick up a Quran and you start reading the English translation, and the anger that's in that Quran makes sense to you because you're angry too. Well, the Saudis have this down to a science. Been doing it for many, many years, and it's very attractive to people who feel cut off from society.
John, I'm curious now to ask you what happens next now that this name is out there. Obviously, 9/11 survives. 9/11 families have wanted to bring lawsuits and hold Saudis accountable. I'm just curious what you think this leak will now mean for the larger 9/11 investigations.
I think there are two separate tracks here. In terms of our official government-to-government relationship with Saudi Arabia, it probably means nothing. That oil for weapons thing is just too important for our leaders, whether Democrats or Republicans, to mess with. And I think that in the long term, it's not going to have any effect at all. But in terms of the families, whether it's Donald Trump or a potential President Joe Biden, I think that whoever happens to be in the White House is going to need and want to throw a bone to the 9/11 families. And, we've got this new bill pending in Congress now. It's really aimed at China, but it would allow lawsuits against sovereign entities. But it could be used against the Saudi government, too. And I think the Saudis, with all their money, are going to want, from a PR perspective, to make this thing go away. And I think at the end of the day, they're probably going to try to throw some money at it.
Yeah, fascinating story nonetheless. Well, that was our weekly revelation segment here this week on Political Misfits, and that was John Kiriakou, the co-host of Loud and Clear. You can check out John and Brian Becker daily from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Radio Sputnik. John, thank you again for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We turn now to our last break of the hour and of the day. You're listening to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, live in D.C. We're back after this.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Welcome back to Political Misfits on Radio Sputnik, where we bring you news, politics, and culture without the red and blue treatment. I'm Bob Schlaber here, sort of kind of with Jamarl Thomas. We continue to bring you live programming. We're about out of here for the day, but hang on with Radio Sputnik. Some great programming coming up after this. You got By Any Means Necessary, followed by Loud and Clear. And then at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, you have Critical Hour. Great shows. I love checking all of them out. Jamarl Thomas, I want to sneak in a few more stories. I didn't want to miss these here on Wednesday, May 13th. One was yesterday, a lawsuit was filed against Louisville, Kentucky police officers over the killing of Breonna Taylor, a 26-year-old emergency medical technician. Breonna was shot 8 times when officers entered her apartment in Louisville on March 13th. Now get this, Jamarl. Officers arrived in unmarked vehicles and in untraditional uniforms at 12:30 a.m. looking to execute a search warrant as part of a drugs investigation. A judge signed off on a no-knock provision, meaning that the police could enter the house without identifying themselves as members of law enforcement. So police entered the home and startling a sleeping Taylor and her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker. Now, Walker, who legally owns guns, fearing that they were being robbed, first fired upon the officers, wounding one officer. Police then, in response, blindly opened up fire on Walker and Taylor. Taylor was shot 8 times and was pronounced dead at the scene. Walker was taken into custody. The Louisville Metro Police investigation records show was centered around a trap house more than 10 miles from Taylor's apartment, and 2 suspects police believed were selling drugs. So you got that right. The house that was under investigation was 10 miles from Breonna Taylor's house. Taylor's address was listed in the search warrant signed by a judge a day before the raid based on police beliefs that one of the narcotics investigation suspects, Jamarcus Glover, used her home to receive mail, keep drugs, or stash money earned from the sale of drugs. So despite though Glover had already been arrested and his house is 10 miles away, the judge still signed a no-knock warrant where they eventually go on to find no drugs or any evidence that linked them to Glover. Ms. Taylor's family says the officers were not looking for her or her partner, but had the wrong complex altogether. Taylor and her boyfriend had no criminal history or drug convictions. Yeah, Jamal, I don't even know what to say. 12:30 in the morning.
This is a situation where I wish each and every one of those cops that went into that room got shot.
What?
They literally, just so we're very clear, they invade somebody else's house at 12 in the morning. They don't acknowledge who they are. Meaning, it's one thing if you knock on the door and say, "Cops, let me in." They didn't do that. They decided to invade that person's house, like you said, on a no-knock warrant. A person who's there, legal resident, a person who's in this country has every right in the world to have guns and every right in the world to defend themselves. I mean, we keep hearing about the defending your castle stuff constantly. Well, in this situation, strangers invade their castle, and they were every right in the world to be able to defend themselves against a hostile force of those cops. The idea that you can murder and put 8 bullets in somebody by going into somebody's house without giving them acknowledgement of who you are. What did they expect to take place? Meaning, if they would have knocked on the door and said, "Cops," what did they think was going to happen? That they couldn't necessarily, meaning, what did you need a no-knock warrant for that you couldn't necessarily effect by just knocking on the door? And then to make the point that they still got it wrong, even on top of that. That's astonishing. I mean, honestly, that...
Yeah, and it's not like it was like Walter White wasn't behind it. I mean, it wasn't like some big drug. It was somebody whose address had been used to receive drug shipments.
Yeah.
What? Why are you doing a 12:30 in the morning raid of somebody's house and then they shoot blindly into the bedroom? There could have been there was a young woman who has lost her life. There could have been children. There could have been any type of other human.
Put this in perspective. This puts you in the mind of the cop that shot through the window. Do you remember this? Where the cop was creeping around this guy's backyard and then eventually looks through the window and then ends up shooting through the window? It's like, what are you doing in this job? There was another one. There was a time on Facebook where I went through and put in 100 stories of cops abusing, attacking, injuring, outright flagrantly disregarding people's rights. Because I wanted to make the point of how common this is, that this continuously happens, where they're able to just get away with this stuff. I mean, the guy who they shot, where the cop says, "Hey, go get your license," and then when the guy reaches for a license, the cop shoots the guy saying, "You flinched." And he says, "Well, you told me to get my license." Yeah, but you flinch. Like, it's this type of nonsense. There's no reason why this should be allowed, and they should be prosecuted for breaking into somebody's house like that. I have no expectation that's going to happen, because the fact that the judge signed off on it allows it to be perfectly fair.
Yeah, an interesting case there. Atiana Jefferson, who you're referencing there in Fort Worth, Texas, and Philando Castile in Minneapolis. I think Falcon Heights there some years ago, to just horrific killings. Yeah, Jamal, and it doesn't stop, right? I mean, we reported on the Ahmaud Arbery case of white vigilantes and now police officers. And it's interesting, you mentioned the castle doctrine, which allows you to protect yourself in your home. And basically, they had legal guns in their home. Somebody comes in without identifying themselves and they open up fire. And then what's the repercussion, right? Because these 3 men are placed on leave. They had the warrant. They went in there and they shot. And so, yeah, I think you're completely right. That there'll be no repercussion
on this no-knock. Like, think of how little we regard the members of our society. Like, this goes back to the whole the Flynn thing, where you basically have the FBI setting somebody up, where they're like, no crime is taking place. However, we're going to basically lay in wait to try to get the guy fired or get the guy arrested. Where in this case, a person who basically just received mail, the cops go in like they're raiding a compound. I mean, let's put this in perspective of how problematic this is. They basically created a situation. By the way, no fault of the cops. Now, the cops might have asked for this, and the cops blindly fired, but the judge signed off on a warrant for those cops to go in without knocking, meaning the situation was set right there, where you could have had a gunfight by everybody behaving legally in that process. Like, this was utterly astonishing ruling that this judge allowed.
But don't fear, Jamal Thomas. Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders have a task force to address criminal justice in the country. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Democrats across the country have been just as complicit in these police killings as Republicans, to say the least. Jamal, we have to get out of here for May 13th. A big thank you to our guests today, Dan Kovalik, John Kiriakou, and Dr. Dave Ragland. Thank you, as always, to Ryan, Dimitri, Andre, and Saul, and the entire Sputnik News team for keeping us going. Shout out to our producer, Michelle Whitty, who produced our episode today. On behalf of Jamal Thomas and myself, Bob Schlehuber, thank you for listening. Now get back to organizing.
Guys, as always, thank you for joining us on the show. We have some chats, so let's go through the chats before we close it out. Let's see. Marcus Will. Thank you, Marcus Will. Leave a comment. Music Corner for processed people. For the dispossessed people. Okay, it's a long word. Wesley Walker Jr., I agree. It is a great show. Aw, thank you, Music Corner for the depressed people. Music Corner for Depressed People. Thank you, Music Corner for Depressed People. It took me a while to read that. Philip Zimmerman. I love you guys, even if you don't blame China. Philip Zimmerman. I don't blame China for what? I mean, China behaved like other nations behave. And basically, a virus started in China, in Wuhan. Whether or not it was in a lab or whether or not it was natural transmission. But let's be very clear. The Trump administration had 3 months, at least 3 months, to prepare for it, and he didn't. Whatever responsibility you want to attach to China, okay, fair enough. But let's just be very clear that it was the Trump administration that failed miserably to deal with the crisis. Let's see. Friday Jones, will we get 200 likes today? Hey, Jamal and Aisha. I hope we get 200 likes today. And there was one more, dealing with depression. Those cops deserve to be in the ground. I agree with you. The catch becomes whether or not it's the cop's fault or the judge's fault. Which one signed that warrant? Which one decided they wanted a no-knock? And whoever decided on that no-knock warrant is the party that's responsible for this particular travesty, because they set up that situation right off the bat. Those cops should have known better than going into somebody's house at 12:30 in the morning. They could have had kids, they could have had guns, and the fact that they didn't announce themselves or that those people didn't know who they were mean those cops were fair game to be shot like any other intruder that was going into the house. I hope you understand what I mean. Those cops, at the point where they're not announcing themselves, should not have any special protections if you're going to do that. And yet, that no-knock warrant basically gives them the protections that they need to basically murder, maim, and kill whatever adult or child or elderly person was in that house. Yes, dealing with depression, I agree with you. Like, share, subscribe.